Well, let's move on with, a bit of a fossil fuels link, in fact, to our international press review with Diptyque Laurent. Hi there.
Hi, Kat.
Fossil fuels really at the heart of the climate debate. And Donald Trump, as we've been reporting, expected to deliver his verdict on whether he wants the United States to remain signed up to the Paris climate deal a little bit later on today.
That's right. He'll make that announcement later on Thursday, and he's widely expected to announce that the U.S. will pull out of the Paris climate change deal.
Although with Donald Trump, who knows?
Although with Donald Trump, it has to be said, maybe take it with a grain of salt. But in any case, if he does quit it, as he has mentioned during his campaign, this would entail steep political and economic costs, according to the Huffington Post, because the U.S. will become the third country after Saudi Arabia and Nicaragua not to sign to the deal, noting that Nicaragua chose not to sign to the deal because it didn't go far enough in curbing carbon emissions. So it's kind of the other side of the spectrum. In any case, for the Huffington Post, if Trump pulls out, it's a decision based on ideology, not business or money, because this is all about Trump wanting to show that he can fulfill a key campaign promise. Because on the other side, you even have coal producers and oil giants like Shell who want the U.S. to stay actively in the deal because of the job opportunities it presents.
It's just such an interesting and surprising story to many people, particularly here in Paris, where the deal was, of course, brought together. A lot of people really worried that this could really spell disaster for the environment. However, the website Politico, says that the deal doesn't actually need the US to be a participant. That's interesting.
It's a really interesting article that kind of gives you the counter perspective. Basically, Politico says, whether Trump is in or not, the green revolution is already underway. The website says that him pulling the U.S. out of the deal won't stop the green energy shift that's already gaining steam. Trump may not back the deal or he may not believe in climate change, but investors, tech giants, car makers, and so forth are pouring money into the green revolution on clean energy, and that's the reason why it won't affect the future of clean energy. Now, that's not to say, though, it won't be painless, because without the U.S., there will be significant economic and political problems. Politico says, for one thing, it'll tear apart global diplomatic unity, but it's not the end of the world.
All right, some optimistic thoughts there from Politico. We'll have that announcement at 3 p.m. Washington time. Moving on now to an Afghan publication, in fact, just over 24 hours on from that enormous suicide truck bombing in Kabul.
That's right, a truck bombing during peak hour in Kabul during the Muslim fasting festival of Ramadan as well. The Afghanistan Times calls it a cowardly attack, one that goes against the very tenets of Islam and non-violence, and says Kabul residents have lost their serenity due to this violence. The paper also calls on a joint effort to fight all terrorists, because essentially they say civilians are paying the highest price right now, and I think that's very true wherever you look in the world right now. The Indian paper The Hindu says that country is facing uncertain times, in particular a steadily deteriorating security situation, one that risks sliding the country back to the chaos of the 1990s.
Let's move on to the prime ministerial debate in the UK, if we can put it that way. That was on British TV on Wednesday evening. This was a 7-way debate. However, the main person, Theresa May, the Prime Minister, wasn't there. What's the verdict?
Well, she didn't turn up, but she sent Amber Rudd in her place. She filled in for the PM. The verdict is, at least according to The Independent, it wasn't as unwatchable as it threatened to be. So not very positive in that sense.
That's a very interesting.
That's a very negative. It's
summation,
sort of a negative response. So it wasn't as unwatchable, but they do criticize both Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party candidate, and Amber Rudd, who, as I said, filled in for Theresa May. Corbyn, the paper says, was on autopilot, while Rudd went for the, quote, hackneyed slogans.
The Independent not impressed.
Not impressed, definitely not impressed. The Times says, well, Theresa May is now facing the heat for not turning up to that debate, especially since she was a bit shown up by Jeremy Corbyn. The Times says she's seeking to rise above accusations of political cowardice today by pitching herself as this unifying leader. She's going to abandon the negative attacks on Corbyn and instead switch to a more optimistic campaign for the rest of the 2 weeks or so that remain, aimed at gaining momentum, in particular with former Labour voters who backed Brexit. Well, will it work? That's definitely something we're going to have to look out for in the next few weeks.
Indeed, not a lot of time left to change the tone. We're going to move on to tennis now. The French Open currently happening, not very far from the France 24 studios, in fact, here in Paris. A former champion making waves, but for all the wrong reasons.
That's right. It's interesting this controversy sort of just come up right in the middle of Roland Garros, so the French Open. Margaret Court is an Australian tennis champion from the 1970s. She won all 4 Grand Slams back in 1970. She was a world number 1. She's incredibly respected. Well, her latest comments have sort of torn apart her legacy. It started out when she announced in a letter that she would boycott national carrier Qantas because of its support for same-sex marriage. Then she called homosexuality, quote, lust of the flesh, and said that gay marriage activists are self-satisfying. She then went on to say there are too many lesbians in women's tennis. Anyway, this whole barrage of quote comments have really drawn scrutiny around her. And sparked calls for Melbourne Park's tennis court, which is named in her honour, to be renamed, I guess, or named in no longer named in her honour.
Interesting indeed. There's been a little tennis controversy every day of this week, it would seem. Thanks very much, Diptyque Laurent, taking us through some international press stories there.